Elena Rodriguez held her rifle steady as she stepped onto the saloon porch. 3 drunk cowboys had trapped young Beth Carter in the alley. Their mean laughter cut through the night air like broken glass. But it wasn't the gun that made them stop moving. It was seeing Reverend Thompson's son standing between them and the scared girl. His white collar was torn. Blood ran from his cut lip. "Step away from her," Daniel Thompson said. His voice wasn't gentle like when he gave Sunday church talks. This was something raw and dangerous. The biggest cowboy spit and sneered. Well, look what we have here." The preacher's boy playing hero. His hand moved toward his gun. "Maybe someone should teach you about the real world, Bible boy." Elena put her finger on the trigger. In Willow Creek, Arizona Territory in 1885, a man could die for less than what these men were planning. Despite all the bad things the town said about her, she wouldn't let them kill the only man who ever looked at her like she was worth saving. "What happens next?" she called out, her Spanish voice cutting through the tension. "Depends on whether you boys are as dumb as you look." The question hanging in the desert air wasn't if blood would be spilled. It was whose blood it would be. Watching Daniel Thompson stand his ground against bad odds, Elena Rodriguez knew she'd already made her choice. Willow Creek had been nothing more than a stop where hope went to die. The drought had lasted 18 months. It turned the valleys into cracked earth that looked like God's broken heart. Daniel Thompson was walking through the market. His arms were full of supplies for the church flour for bread, oil for lamps, medicine for old Mrs. Hayes' sore joints. That's when fate stepped in. He came around the corner just as Elena Rodriguez backed out of Garcia's store with a heavy box of bottles. They crashed into each other. Glass broke on the wooden sidewalk. Whiskey mixed with dust. For a moment they stood frozen, the preacher's son and the saloon owner's widow, surrounded by broken bottles. "I'm very sorry," Daniel said, dropping to help pick up the bottles that weren't broken. His eyes met hers for the first time. Something electric passed between them. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. He saw smart eyes and something else, loneliness, maybe. "No harm done," Elena said, her voice carrying the soft sound of Mexico. "Though I suppose this is what they call a bad sign." She took his hand as he helped her stand. Her fingers stayed against his palm longer than needed. That's when he saw what else she'd been carrying. Hidden under the bottles were small packages, medicine, food, children's shoes. While he'd been getting supplies for God's house, she'd been gathering things for God's forgotten children. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, knowing her now from the pointed whispers that followed her through town. "I didn't know you were taking care of the Murphy children since their father broke his leg in the mine?" Her smile was sharp as winter wind. "Or buying medicine for the Garcia's baby." "Careful, Mr. Thompson. People might think you see me as human." Before he could answer, she was walking away. But she'd left something behind, a small package of fever medicine. When Daniel picked it up, he saw the name written in her careful writing. Tommy Davis, age 6. That night, as he brought the medicine to the Davis shack on the edge of town, Daniel Thompson began to understand that everything he'd been told about Elena Rodriguez might be a lie. And more dangerously, everything he'd been told about himself might be a lie too. The drought ended 2 weeks later. But instead of relief, the rains brought trouble. Miners came to Willow Creek with heavy pockets of silver and short tempers from months of hard work. The Silver Dollar Saloon became the center of every fight. One rainy evening, Daniel saw what the good people of Willow Creek liked to ignore. 3 miners had cornered 15-year-old Beth Carter behind the church. Their plan was clear from the terror in her eyes. Daniel didn't think. He just acted, stepping from the shadows with nothing but anger and prayer. "Let her go." The miners turned, their faces showing amusement. "Look here," the biggest one said, his beard stained with tobacco. "The holy man wants to play." What happened next broke every idea Daniel had about his own strength. The first punch sent him into the mud. The second brought blood to his mouth. He was on his knees, arms around his head, when the sound of a Winchester rifle being cocked cut through the rain. "Gentlemen," Elena's voice carried the kind of power that came from running a business where weakness meant death. She stood at the mouth of the alley, rain making her black hair stick to her neck, the rifle steady in her hands. I think the young lady would rather you left. The miners looked between the gun and the woman holding it. Elena settled the question by putting a bullet in the wooden fence 6 inches from the leader's head. Next one goes between your eyes, Jake Wilson, she said. Daniel was amazed she knew the man's name. Your choice. They left, muttering curses and threats, but they left. Beth ran home crying with relief. Daniel found himself alone in the rain with the woman his father called the devil's own temptation. You could have been killed, Elena said, helping him stand. Her touch was gentle as she checked his injuries. That was either very brave or very stupid, Daniel said, wincing as she looked at his split lip. Probably both, she agreed. Come on. Let's get you cleaned up before your church people see their shepherd looking like he lost a fight. The inside of the Silver Dollar Saloon wasn't what Daniel had expected. Yes, there were bottles and card tables, but there were also books on shelves, curtains on windows, and a small area in the back where children's books sat next to writing slates. You teach them, he said. Someone has to, Elena replied, pouring warm water into a bowl. The government promised a school teacher 2 years ago. We're still waiting. She cleaned the cut on his cheek with surprising gentleness. Drink? She asked. I don't. Coffee, she said with amusement dancing in her dark eyes. Though Lord knows after tonight you might want something stronger. As she took care of his wounds, she talked about her late husband Carlos, who died in a mine cave-in 18 months ago, about getting a business she never wanted but learning to run it because the other choice was starving, about the loneliness of being the town outcast, respected for her strength but feared for her independence. People need someone to blame for their own weakness, she said, cleaning blood from his knuckles. It's easier than looking at themselves. Is that why you stay? Daniel asked. To give them someone to blame? Elena paused, her eyes meeting his in the lamplight. I stay because this is my home now, and because sometimes someone needs to stand between the wolves and the sheep. She smiled, soft and sad. Even if the sheep don't always like it. When he left that night, walking through muddy streets toward the church house, Daniel Thompson carried more than just bruises. He carried the image of Elena Rodriguez's hands on his skin, the sound of her laughter, and the dangerous knowledge that everything he'd been taught about sin and salvation might be more complicated than he'd ever imagined. The meetings began innocently. Elena had said she needed help with the children's lessons. Daniel found himself offering to help. After all, education was godly work, wasn't it? The fact that it meant spending time with Elena was just a coincidence. 3 evenings a week, after the last drunk had left the Silver Dollar, Daniel would slip through the back door. The saloon changed in these quiet hours. Tables were pushed aside. Children's voices replaced the rough laughter of miners and cowboys. Elena was a gifted teacher, patient with slow learners, encouraging with bright ones. Reading opens doors, she told 10-year-old Luis Garcia, guiding his finger along the words. Every book is a new world waiting for you to explore. Daniel watched from across the room, helping little Rosa Santos with her numbers. But his attention kept moving to Elena, the way lamplight caught the auburn threads in her hair, the gentle curve of her neck as she bent over a child's slate. Mr. Thompson, Rosa tugged at his sleeve. You're staring again. Heat flooded Daniel's face. I was just watching teaching methods. Elena glanced up, catching his embarrassment, and smiled. It was different from the sharp, defensive smile she wore during the day. This one was warm, intimate, meant only for him. After the children went home, they would sit by the dying fire, talking about everything and nothing. Elena told him about her childhood in Mexico, the poverty that drove her family to America. The dreams she'd had before life taught her that survival mattered more than hope. I wanted to be a teacher, she said one night, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table between them. A proper one in a real school. Foolish, perhaps. Not foolish, Daniel said. Beautiful. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Elena's eyes met his, and for a moment the careful distance they'd kept threatened to collapse. Daniel, she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer and a curse. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was warm, rough from hard work but soft in places that made his breath catch. Elena, this is dangerous, she said, but she didn't pull away. For both of us. I know. His thumb traced across her knuckles. I know what they'll say, what he'll say. They both knew who he was. Reverend Samuel Thompson's disapproval had been growing stronger each week. His sermons were taking on pointed references to temptation and moral weakness. He loves you, Elena said. He's afraid of losing you, and I'm afraid of losing myself if I don't. Daniel let the sentence trail off, unwilling to say what they both understood. That night, as he walked home through empty streets, Daniel Thompson made a choice that would change everything. He would no longer hide what he felt for Elena Rodriguez. The confrontation came on a Sunday morning in the church where Daniel had spent his whole life learning about grace and forgiveness. Reverend Samuel Thompson stood before his congregation, his weathered hands gripping the pulpit, his eyes finding his son in the front pew. There are wolves among us, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of Old Testament authority. Wolves in sheep's clothing, leading the righteous astray with false promises and sinful temptations. Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew where this was going. The Lord commands us to be separate from the world, Samuel continued, his gaze never leaving his son's face, to avoid even the appearance of evil. There are those among us who would compromise our principles, who would drag us down into the mire of sin and degradation. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. The mayor's wife whispered to her neighbor. Both women looked meaningfully toward the back of the church, where Daniel realized Elena Rodriguez sat alone. She'd come to church despite everything, despite the whispers and judgment. She'd put on her best dress and walked into the very heart of the community that scorned her. Her chin was raised, her dark eyes defiant, but Daniel could see the cost of her courage. Some may ask, Samuel's voice rose, why we allow such corruption to exist in our midst? Why we permit establishments of vice and immorality to flourish while godly folks struggle to raise their children in righteousness? Every eye in the congregation turned toward Elena. The collective judgment was thick as smoke. Daniel watched her hands clench in her lap, saw the moment when her defiance began to crack. He stood up. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. His father paused mid-sentence, shock replacing anger on his weathered face. If I may, Father, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I'd like to share something with the congregation. Samuel's eyes flashed warning, but he stepped aside. Daniel walked to the pulpit, acutely aware that every person in Willow Creek was watching. Instead of denouncing Elena, he looked directly at her, drawing strength from her presence. I've learned something these past few months, he began. I've learned that grace isn't something we earn through perfect behavior or spotless reputations. It's something we give and something we receive, often from the most unexpected sources. Mrs. Patterson's fan snapped shut with an audible crack. I have seen a woman feed hungry children with her own money while respectable folk crossed the street to avoid them. I've seen her teach reading and arithmetic to youngsters the government forgot existed. I've seen her stand between danger and innocence, asking nothing in return but basic human decency. Elena's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she held his gaze steadily. And I've learned, Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger, that sometimes the person everyone calls a sinner is doing more of God's work than the person everyone calls a saint. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Mayor Williams cleared his throat and began to clap. Well said, Daniel, he declared. Well said indeed. Others joined in, not everyone, but enough. Mrs. Garcia, whose children Elena taught. Tom Bradley, whose broken arm Elena had helped set. Beth Carter's parents, who knew exactly who had saved their daughter. But not Samuel Thompson. The Reverend stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed world crumble. After the service, Daniel approached his father. Samuel's face was pale, aged 10 years in 20 minutes. You've made your choice, the older man said quietly. I pray God it doesn't damn you both. And I pray, Daniel replied, that you will find it in your heart to trust the son you raised to know right from wrong. Outside, Elena waited by the church steps, uncertain for perhaps the first time since he'd known her. When she saw him, relief flooded her features. That was either very brave, she said, or very stupid. Daniel took her gloved hand in his, no longer caring who saw. Definitely both. The retaliation came 3 nights later, swift and brutal as a desert storm. Daniel was in his study preparing Sunday's sermon when the sound of breaking glass shattered the evening quiet. Through his window, he could see orange flames dancing against the night sky, flames coming from the direction of the Silver Dollar Saloon. He ran through empty streets, his heart hammering. By the time he reached the saloon, half the town had gathered to watch. Some had brought buckets for fighting the fire. Others had brought chairs as if settling in for entertainment. Where is she? Daniel grabbed Tom Bradley by the arm. Where's Elena? Inside, far as anyone knows, Bradley replied grimly. Front doors barred from the outside. Someone doesn't want her getting out. The crowd parted as Daniel pushed through, his eyes scanning faces until he found what he was looking for. 3 miners from the Silver Strike mine, the same ones who'd confronted him and Beth Carter weeks ago. Their leader, Jake Wilson, stood with his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his tobacco-stained lips. Shame about the fire, Wilson said loud enough for everyone to hear. Of course, some folks might say it's divine justice. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Don't he, preacher boy? Daniel didn't waste time with words. His fist connected with Wilson's jaw with a satisfying crack, sending the larger man sprawling into the dust. The crowd gasped, Daniel Thompson, the gentle preacher's son, throwing punches like a common brawler. The bar. Elena's voice came from inside the building, muffled by smoke and terror. I can't move it. While the miners regrouped, Daniel threw his shoulder against the heavy timber that had been wedged across the front entrance. The wood was new, strong, chosen specifically for this purpose. Smoke poured from beneath the door, and he could hear Elena coughing inside. Help me, he shouted to the crowd. For God's sake, help me. Some moved forward, Bradley, Mayor Williams, a few others. But more hung back, uncertain whether saving Elena Rodriguez was worth defying whoever had orchestrated this night's work. That's when the Winchester cracked from behind them. Reverend Samuel Thompson stood at the edge of the crowd, his hunting rifle trained on Jake Wilson and his companions. The old man's hands shook slightly, but his voice was rock steady. Step away from my son, Samuel commanded. All of you, step away now. Wilson spat blood, his hand moving toward his gun. Samuel's rifle swung toward him with practiced precision. I was killing Apaches when you were still suckling at your mother's teat, boy, Samuel said quietly. Try me. The bar across the door gave way with a splintering crash. Elena stumbled out, her dress torn, her face streaked with soot, but alive. Daniel caught her in his arms, feeling her body shake against his chest. It's all right, he whispered into her hair. You're safe now. But even as he held her, Daniel knew nothing would ever be all right again. Lines had been crossed, choices made that couldn't be unmade. Wilson and his men slipped away into the darkness, their leader's threats carried on the desert wind. The fire was contained before it could spread beyond the saloon, but the damage was done, not just to the building, but to any pretense that this conflict could be resolved peacefully. Thank you, Elena whispered to Samuel Thompson, who still stood guard with his rifle. The old preacher's eyes were sad but resolved. Don't thank me yet, daughter, he replied. The real fight hasn't even started. Dawn came slowly to Willow Creek, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Daniel sat on the steps of the damaged saloon, Elena beside him, both watching the sun climb over distant mountains. Your father surprised me, Elena said, her voice hoarse from smoke. He surprised himself, I think, Daniel replied. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us who we really are. Samuel Thompson had returned to the parsonage after the fire, his duty done. But Daniel knew the old man was struggling, caught between rigid beliefs and undeniable evidence that grace sometimes came from unexpected sources. The town council will meet today, Elena continued. There will be talk of closing the saloon, of driving out the undesirable elements. She smiled ruefully. Meaning me. And what will you do? Elena was quiet for a long moment. I've been thinking about what you said in church. About grace. About unexpected sources. She turned to face him fully. What if we gave them something unexpected? What do you mean? Daniel thought of his father's rifle, steady in defense of what was right, of the faces in the crowd who had stepped forward to help when help was needed, of the children who came to Elena's backroom school because they had nowhere else to learn. The church won't accept you as a minister's wife, he said. Then maybe it's time for a different kind of ministry. They were married 3 weeks later by Judge Martinez, who'd ridden in from Phoenix for the occasion. The ceremony took place not in the church. Samuel Thompson had made it clear that would be a bridge too far, but in the schoolhouse that Elena and Daniel had built together in the saloon's back room. Half the town attended. The other half stayed away, their disapproval as real as the desert heat. But those who came brought gifts, children, and the kind of hope that grows in unlikely soil. Samuel Thompson stood in the back, his face unreadable. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the old preacher didn't cheer with the others, but he didn't leave either. And when Daniel looked back, seeking some sign of forgiveness or acceptance, Samuel nodded once. Not approval, perhaps, but acknowledgement that his son had made his choice and would live with the consequences. As the sun set over Willow Creek that evening, Daniel and Elena Thompson sat on the porch of their home, the rebuilt Silver Dollar, now serving coffee and education along with the whiskey that kept the doors open. The future stretched before them, uncertain as any frontier, but filled with the promise of what they could build together. Do you regret it? Elena asked, her head resting on his shoulder. Daniel pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair, the lingering smoke from the rebuilding, the desert sage that grew wild beyond the town limits. The only thing I regret, he said, is waiting so long to realize that sometimes salvation comes disguised as temptation, and the only sin is being too afraid to recognize grace when it's standing right in front of you.